Hi, my name is Stella Zine, and my co-presenter is Lindsay Roberts. We will be speaking on anti-trafficking legislation and its intersections with drug policy and the drug war. We are presenting this information from harm reduction perspectives. Since 2016, I've been a contract worker for Live Forward AIDS Athens, where I facilitate harm reduction based expressive arts therapy and mental health support groups. Though, due to COVID-19, I am regrouping to move into telehealth platforms. For transparency purposes, I'm a queer former sex worker and a former substance user who has dealt with substance use disorder. I spent 15 years in the sex trade, 10 of which were in Atlanta, where I was a dancer in the strip clubs. I also worked in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. I was mostly a dancer, but I also did dom work, lingerie modeling, and phone sex. My experience as a sex worker both influenced and was a catalyst for my becoming a harm reductionist and a human rights activist focused on prison abolition and ending the racist drug war. When I was a sex worker, I was a board member for Atlanta Harm Reduction Coalition, and my activism and recovery continue to center human rights and harm reduction perspectives. This has been a running thread for me through the past 24 years. Harm reduction was integral in my recovery, specifically in reducing harm in sex work, especially condoms and strategies to reduce violence. It is very important for me to be clear that the way I use the word recovery absolutely does not require abstinence. Because my own physical and mental health issues, I have been abstinent for 24 years as part of my recovery, but that is not a requirement for my concept of recovery. Um, yeah, and I'm a survivor of interpersonal violence when I was a sex worker, and blackouts put me into many dangerous situations, and eventually abstinence became a survival tool to stay alive. By some state and organizational definitions, I am a survivor of trafficking, but I myself don't identify that way. Some in the anti-trafficking movement would see me as suffering from false consciousness, or say that I'm not representative of most sex workers, which works to silence many of our voices. I reject being framed as having a false consciousness. The reclamation of self-agency is one of the ways I've been in recovery for 24 years, including 7 of those years where I was doing sex work. A major reason that having a sense of self-agency is so important to the recovery and healing process is that we abuse control, is that, not that we, is that abuse, control, coercion, lies, and gaslighting are what victims of trafficking, domestic violence, and interpersonal violence already have been navigating. Lots of spaces with no agency, or where we have felt like we had no agency. So being around people, spaces, and services with people who respect our decisions and give us the trust and dignity to find solutions that work best for us is incredibly healing. Ultimately, criminal and carceral solutions for public health issues, as Elizabeth Bernstein, women's studies professor at Barnard, refers to as militarized humanism, is a recipe for disastrous consequences and genocidal collateral damage, which just does not create the spaces we need for healing the traumas from the violence we have endured. Being forced to exit sex work through a politic of criminalization via the partnership of the police and coercive social services is what I call an arrest queue, a term I've developed and I will go into more detail later. An arrest queue is the opposite of self-agency. It is disempowering and reinforces our traumas. autonomy undermining, exiting programs that mandate social services to adult women, that require participants to denounce prostitution, and that pathologize our ingenious harm reduction survival strategies and the choices we have made to survive and stay alive are hurting us more than helping us heal trauma. Telling adult women what they can and can't do with their bodies is archaic and is re-traumatizing because that's what we lived in as survivors of trafficking and domestic violence and intimate partner violence. If the true goal of anti-trafficking policies is ending violence, abuse, and coercion, then restoring dignity, self-agency, and our abilities to make choices that impact our bodies and our lives need to be foundational in policy and social services, whether we need to leave or continue doing sex work. I am deeply grateful for the Atlanta Harm Reduction Coalition that met me where I was at as a sex worker and for 7 years provided safe sex supplies to me, never making me identify as a prostituted person or a trafficked victim or trafficking victim or requiring me to be, quote, exiting, as many anti-trafficking organizations require before they even offer resources in healthcare. As a queer sex worker, I would have never opened up to an organization that took away my sense of self-agency, especially a faith-based anti-trafficking org requiring me to exit. Even 12-step groups say the program tools are only a suggestion. The big book is written as to not take away self-agency. And I'm excited about this virtual harm reduction conference and about Lindsay and about digging deeper into the complex, nuanced topic of anti-trafficking policy in this session.
So I'll start by saying a little bit about who I am. I was a queer former foster kid with mental illness and social skills issues, and I wanted to be a therapist. I started on a journey towards becoming licensed, and along the way worked at a women's center, a crisis center, a research lab, and as a kids therapist. I earned a master's in social work and learned a whole lot about harm reduction and vulnerable communities. But along the way, my mental health and ability to function in an office environment plummeted, and I ended up working as a full service sex worker for my main source of income. I've been doing that since 2014. After I graduated, I realized that I just couldn't hack the nonprofit scene anymore. I realized I wanted to do something more radical and started doing leftist activist work. I joined Urban Survivors Union, where I am a sex worker organizer, and I met Stella, and North Carolina Survivors Union, where I'm a board member and the sex worker liaison. I'm a sex worker who uses drugs. I've also been a social worker, so I have a perspective from both sides of the divide. I realize I'm probably going to be a sex worker forever, and likewise, I hope to never stop doing activist work. So when I talk to you today, I'm really talking from my heart. Towards the beginning of our presentation, we'll be covering some information about anti-trafficking legislation and the history of the drug war. Some people here who have been doing a lot of advocacy for sex workers may already know some of this information, but we want to make sure that we really get a grasp on what's been going on historically with anti-trafficking policy. Then I'm going to talk about what coercion actually looks like to us and how that differs from the narratives painted by anti-traffickers. We are also going to talk really specifically about the PROTECT Act, an upcoming piece of anti-trafficking legislation, so we hope there will be something new for everyone here.
Firstly, I would like to briefly define terms, but I don't want to get too hung up on them because definitions alone could be a huge topic. According for Data for Progress, which researches policy to help legislators understand the complex nuances of sex work and trafficking, trafficking, as defined by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, is the recruitment, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by improper means, such as threat, use of force, coercion, abduction, and fraud. for forced labor and/or sexual exploitation. While trafficking exists in every industry and the majority of trafficking victims are not in the sex industry, trafficking is often conflated with sex work. Really important point. Under US law, trafficking must involve force, fraud, or coercion that causes someone to do labor, sexual or otherwise. So, what is the sex trade? According to data for Progress, again, people engage in the sex trades, also referred to sex work, commercial or transactional sex, or prostitution, when they exchange sexual services for money, housing, food, drugs, healthcare, or any other resource. Sex work can be legal or criminalized, short term or long term, serve as a primary or supplemental income, can be conducted independently or with other people. Like with other forms of labor, people trade sex for reasons that exist on a spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion. Most sex workers trade out of circumstance to meet economic needs such as healthcare, housing, or childcare. They may experience explicit discrimination in the informal economy because of disability, gender identity, or immigration status, and rely on sex work to meet basic needs. They may find part of the sex industry to have a low barriers of entry, allowing them to immediately access income for a short period of time in the industry before exiting. They may find that the freelance or independent nature of the work allows them more flexibility to caretake families or pursue interests. So those are some definitions. And critiquing dangerous anti-trafficking legislation is very challenging because it requires distilling complex dissertation amounts of information into an easy to understand talk, a short brochure, or a cute meme. In other words, it's next to impossible. And as difficult as even talking about this topic is, especially in the South, we must do it. The criminalization of sex work and migration is massively profitable to the state. Hey, what could go wrong? Hint, the prison industrial complex. Although it can seem like an uphill battle, our job as harm reductionists is to do the hard work of helping voters not be manipulated into voting for politicians that create harmful and genocidal anti-trafficking legislation. Legislators and voters need to be made aware of the horrific consequences that anti-trafficking legislation has had for the collateral damage causing so much destruction and ruining so many lives. This has been similar to what has happened due to the years of mass incarceration from the drug wars. Why do I say genocidal? Because, as so eloquently described in the movie 13th, it is primarily Black and Indigenous people and other people of color who are channeled into the prison industrial complex. Most certainly, Black people are the folks disproportionately incarcerated here in the U.S. South. The U.S. war on drugs and the U.S. war on trafficking are so similar that we are seeing that they are branches of the same thing, another pillar of white supremacy, in that mostly people of color were and are still being put in prison for very long sentences for what should be petty low-level charges, if any charges at all. These dog whistle styled initiatives have nothing but genocidal results. This is what happens when public health issues get turned into criminal justice issues. We are now witnessing much anti-trafficking legislation that is no longer even veiling that the intent is to push bad drug policy and further the drug war. For example, the proposed PROTECT Act. As Lindsay mentioned, both she and myself are members of a group, Urban Survivors Union's sex worker organizing group, that is spearheading a campaign to oppose the protecting rights of those exploited by coercive trafficking, or the PROTECT Act of 2019. This bill targets drug-using trafficking survivors. It claims to protect, We will both be speaking on this initiative and on ways to oppose this legislation. We've been working on creating information for legislative staffers to let them know what would be damaging to sex workers and trafficking victims who use drugs and what kind of initiatives would actually help. But the PROTECT Act is just one example. Many, if not most, anti-trafficking laws incorporate an effective militarized humanism with the goal to stop forced sex labor, even while the solution just further endangers the victims of trafficking and violence. In other words, most anti-trafficking legislation actually creates victims while being disguised as attempts to stop forced sex labor. Sadly, anti-trafficking legislation is more accurately just another tool for the drug war. Currently, under Georgia law, already, if a sex worker works with a friend or another sex worker for safety, that other person could be arrested for pimping, pandering, or trafficking, which are all felony charges. These kind of laws result in sex workers having to work alone in more dangerous situations, becoming isolated from health services and the ability to seek justice. As long as aspects of adult voluntary sex work are criminalized, sex workers will not be able to seek support from the police if they are being raped, assaulted, exploited, or trafficked. The irony here is that these laws create more oppressive situations for sex workers. And police brutality is a very real concern, making reaching out for support next to impossible for sex workers, especially Black sex workers who already have to navigate the added possibility of being injured or killed during arrests fueled by racism. So I want to share a slide with y'all. Sex work is not trafficking. It's a really important part. In April of 2018, Trump signed a new piece of very dangerous and flawed legislation called FOSTA-SESTA. Like most anti-trafficking legislation, it used very broad language and results in policies that conflate sex trafficking with sex work. It also makes fighting sex trafficking more difficult. FOSTA-SESTA targeted online advertising platforms by making them responsible for any sex trafficking or sex work that goes on through their sites. While that may seem reasonable, the internet has been built on the idea that we can have platforms for free speech. If platforms like Craigslist have to personally review everything that is posted on their site, they would have to pay a team of people to review it. The only solution for them is to widely and indiscriminately ban everything that they may have to review or charge large amounts for people to use their services. This legislation even resulted in Tumblr saying you could no longer post anything erotic at all. In some cases, platforms have had to respond by banning language related to harm reduction, sex education, and other things that may have bannable keywords. It deplatformed consensually working sex workers, pushing many offline and into more dangerous street-based work. Working on the street has incredibly high rates of violence and extremely high rates of arrest, especially for Black and Indigenous and other people of color or Indigenous transgender women, for Black transgender women. It has led to sex workers needing to find third parties, commonly called pimps, to help find clients because clients do not know how to find sex workers anymore. By having to use pre-internet ways of finding clients, sex workers have less ability to screen. That means they have trouble finding out if clients are safe or not. In some places, street arrests of sex workers have quadrupled or quintupled. The passing of FOSTA SESTA created embedded levels of challenges in the age of COVID for street-based sex workers and other people who use drugs and work in street-based informal economies. According to Tamika Spellman, Policy and Advocacy Director for HIPS in Washington, D.C., a Black trans woman who is also a member of Urban Survivors Union sex worker organizing group, said that many of the police in DC tested positive for COVID, and the virus was running rampant in their police department and in the jailing systems. So, how are sex workers who've had to move to working on the street supposed to shelter in place? Tamika is also a member of Decrim Now, um, the Decrim Now campaign, and has been advocating for the police not to have contact with and to stop arresting people in street and informal economies to help slow the spread of the virus to sex workers who, due to FOSTA SESTA, are more dependent on street-based sex work. Criminalization creates poverty, violence, and trafficking. And a criminal record makes it hard to access housing and numerous social programs or receive government funded grants to go to school. And because violent clients or traffickers are not online anymore, the FBI and others can't track them. All FOSTA SESTA did was serve to push people onto the street and away from accessing healthcare and housing assistance. Certainly, there are nuances in any labor force within capitalism that create a spectrum of situations between exploitation and voluntary employment. And the same is true of sex work. But conflating voluntary adult sex work with trafficking fuels laws that kill people. Much like the drug war, the anti-trafficking movement is mostly a politic of racist dog and wolf whistles that fuel the prison industrial complex and white supremacy. The word trafficker, much like the terms pimp and thug, is also subject to dog whistle politics and the expression of racism through code. As co-founder of Atlanta's Sister Song and Smith professor Loretta Ross teaches in her class The Rise of White Supremacy in the Age of Trump, we have gone from the dog whistle to the wolf whistle, where there isn't even any pretense where racism is more overt and where racism is more overt. And we continue to see this play out in the militarized humanism that is the anti-trafficking movement. And as it merges with the racist drug war, disproportionately channeling Black and Indigenous people and other people of color and other poor folks, all kinds of poor, but mostly Black and Indigenous and people of color into the criminal injustice system. Police and social services can be a primary source of harm for people in the sex trade. Undocumented sex workers face violence from the state or even deportation if they report that they have been raped or are a victim of a crime. While some anti-trafficking and anti-domestic violence legislation tries to exempt undocumented migrants if they report trafficking, the current political atmosphere, combined with the hoops one has to jump through to gain an exemption, leaves most unwilling to attempt reporting their abusers or traffickers. Until adult voluntary sex work is decriminalized in the US, in the United States, sex workers, and including migrants, sex workers will continue to be isolated and more vulnerable to violence. A problem of the US anti-trafficking narrative is evident here in Georgia's safe harbor legislation. This passed in 2016, which exaggerates and even falsifies trafficking statistics and conflates it with adult voluntary sex work. Why are there absolutely no sources for the statistics that are cited on the Safe Harbor webpage? There is no peer-reviewed research that the page acknowledges when stating these numbers. According to the Government Accountability Office, most of the estimates of human trafficking are in doubt. Yet, Safe Harbor is not at all transparent about their resources. Here's what the webpage says. Every year in Georgia, hundreds of Georgia's children are trafficked and exploited. Cases have been reported in 102 counties covering 60% of the state. The average age of a child victim of sex trafficking is only 13, and they can be as young as 9. Well, who are their sources? First of all, are they peer reviewed? This absolutely matters. Why did they not list any sources for the claim that there are hundreds of children trafficked? Also, the definition of trafficking varies across different organizations. So how can they even have accurate data about trafficking victims at all, really? Are they only talking about sex trafficking or forced labor? When statistics are inaccurate or false, it is highly unethical and even criminal to receive funds based on them. Are these numbers based on the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation stats? They probably are not, but even if they were, we would need to ask for the actual records of who is being arrested for trafficking. Very few people are arrested yearly for trafficking, and what does that actually mean here? Lindsay will be pointing out that even when people are arrested for trafficking, many of them are actually trafficking victims getting a charge. And who are the hundreds of victims in Georgia? These are public records. We need to see them. We need to know what the arrests are actually for and how trafficking is being defined by each data collection. Lindsay will share more on what the quote unquote trafficking violence that sex workers face and deal with what it really looks like. In Georgia, 54 adult sex workers were arrested as part of the Operation Cross Country 2016 nationwide anti-trafficking sting. This sting happened between October 13th and 16th of 2016 and was carried out by the Atlanta FBI's Metro Atlanta Child Exploitation Task Force. They rescued one person under 18. One. I repeat, only one person under 18 was found. And this is important. And that person was arrested, not even, quote, saved. Also, there were 15 people total arrested for trafficking. So 15 people got arrested for trafficking. Operation Cross Country is supposedly one of the largest stings that happen in Georgia through the year. So how can the Safe Harbor Yes webpage claim that there are hundreds of children in Georgia being trafficked? Where are they getting the numbers? Also, for the one underage person that the FBI found in the sex trade, 54 adult women that were voluntary sex workers were arrested and had their lives destroyed. That's a hell of a lot of sloppy collateral damage. We need to let that sink in. I'd like to talk a little more about Operation Cross Country. It's brutal. It's a brutal, nationwide, militarized FBI raid and rescue style anti-trafficking initiative with a track record for arresting adult voluntary sex workers. This sting is supposedly designed to quote, rescue and, quote, recover victims of underaged forced sex labor, or as the FBI calls, underaged human trafficking. But the majority of the raids involve officers making contact with adult women that are voluntary sex workers while pretending to be clients and then arresting them, and sometimes even taking their money and belongings. As an aside, many localities' stings involved sexual contact between officers and sex workers. Sometimes officers go so far as to have sex and then arrest the sex workers and take their money in what I consider to be one of the most disturbing ways to actually rescue someone. Amendment 2, Safe Harbor legislation and fund are Georgia's version of an rescue initiative and were written into our Georgia Constitution, which establishes a permanent fund to support Christian quote unquote services for people they rescue. And what will these services and therapies for the safe harbor look like? Forced, forced rehabilitation can be another arm of the prison industrial complex, and some would say is another arm, further harming marginalized communities and young people in the sex trade. Are the services that get these funds evidence-based? Are they? They are in fact often based on Christianity, faith-based, and involved religious education. Do they incorporate harm reduction strategies to meet drug-using sex workers and drug-using trafficking victims where they're at? They are often based on abstinence-only models. Do they offer medicated assisted treatment? Not often. Also, are the safe harbor services safe for trans women and LGBT teens and children, or do the services that get the funds have anti-transgender and anti-gay agendas, or do they carry them out? I did some research and found a link to an organization called Wellspring Living in Georgia on the Safe Harbor Yes Amendment 2 webpage in 2016. And I did some more recent research on them. And Wellspring Living appears to be a social service for children and women who have been victims of trafficking that is partnering with the Safe Harbor Initiative, this new fund and legislation. They were partnering with them in 2016. It is a residence program that appears to have received funds. In the career section of Wellspring Living webpage, they are currently hiring a clinician to work with girls that are between 12 and 17. And they have some pretty telling qualifications that they seek for their child care workers. As physical requirements, they list must have ability to administer physical restraints as governed by policies and procedures of programs. Wellspring Living says they are looking to hire a child care worker that are required to model a forced Christian relationship with the Lord. Now it says faith-based. They took that part out, but they kept in the part that they are required, the clinician is required to be able to physically able to administer restraints. This is a recipe for child abuse. There needed to be an investigation into what was going on there in 2016, and there still needs to be an investigation now that the Safe Harbor Amendment Fund has passed, and they got a portion of the millions of dollars to up their game. We can and must do better. According to the UN World Health Organization, the UN HIV Law Commission, Lambda Legal, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, laws criminalizing adult voluntary sex work contradict their human rights and create more dangerous situations for all sex workers, included those forced and voluntary. The link between health, safety, and criminalization for sex workers is complicated, deeply connected, and intertwined. A really helpful way to understand how problematic U.S. trafficking legislation is, including Georgia's Amendment 2, is to look at how damaging the war on drugs has been on Black communities. Politicians like Obama have come out to say the war on drugs was an arm of the new Jim Crow, and that mass incarceration channeled mostly people of color into the prison industrial complex. Our country has made big mistakes, ruined lives, and has needed to apologize to many people who were unfairly incarcerated. There are also still many people unfairly incarcerated to this day due to the drug crime bill. This is exactly what is happening with the war on trafficking. In the documentary 13th, Obama is quoted saying, America is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Unfortunately, people are slow to act against the drug war. Biden um, authored, the Democratic candidate Biden authored the 1994 crime bill, and he, of course, became Obama's vice president and is now a potential president. Kamala Harris, who a couple of days ago was picked by Biden as his vice president, continued to crack down when she was working under Obama. And the war on crime, the war on drugs, and now the war on trafficking are all vehicles to fuel and carry out this racist U.S. carceral nightmare. And they are not partisan. Both Republicans and Democrats have thrown themselves behind the tough on crime stance. For the prison industry to grow, it thrives on broad and vague laws that create a mass public, quote, moral concern, and dog whistling so that many people get swept up under the umbrella of criminalization. On the flip side, and on a positive note, helpful and life-saving legislation working to dismantle the drug war is also bipartisan. In 2019, Republican Georgia Representative Houston Gaines, who also before COVID was scheduled to keynote this conference, sponsored groundbreaking legislation to decriminalize syringe exchange programs here in our state, here in Georgia, and it passed. Yay! North Carolina and Georgia now have Good Samaritan laws created by Republican co-sponsored bills, and Democrats, Senators Elizabeth Warren, on the flip side, on the Democrat side, Elizabeth Warren and Senator Bernie Sanders have co-sponsored legislation introduced by Representative Ro Khanna to study the negative effects of Sesta Fosta, which could be the first step towards decriminalization. Dismantling harmful policy that is stoking the opiate epidemic and harming sex workers and victims of trafficking can also absolutely be bipartisan. One of the main problems when discussing this topic is it is very complex to understand even what the definitions of trafficking is. The definition of trafficking is. There can be different definitions across various organizations and in different states. Trafficking terminology is very broad and vague and can mean many things to different politicians, to police, to social services, and to voters. So it creates a perfect storm and makes it super easy for politicians to just utter the word trafficking. And what about the children? While armed with unchecked and even false statistics that create a moral panic and witch hunt. And the resulting legislation commands lots of money, which politicians and anti-trafficking organizations easily receive. Yes, it's true that forced sexual labor and exploitation does exist, and that is why it's important not to implement dangerous legislation that further harms sex workers, people on street-based economies, transgender women via unfair profiling, homeless people, people of color, and true victims of forced or underage sex labor that is usually referred to as trafficking. And I had another little part that I wanted to read to y'all off my phone here. Anti-trafficking initiatives twist rhetoric so that well-intentioned voters get tricked into voting and for something that will actually harm impoverished women. And many anti-trafficking organizations and policies have utilized rhetoric to create a prohibition-like moral panic. This tactic is used to fuel anti-trafficking legislation that results in channeling mostly poor Black women, Black men, and especially trans women of color into prisons. And anti-trafficking laws ironically actually create dangerous situations where sexual exploitation is more likely to occur. And let's be clear about this, is that being against anti-trafficking legislation, such as the PROTECT Act, in no way means that one is pro-trafficking. Asking senators to vote no or pro-violence, no way. Asking senators to vote no to the PROTECT Act just means you understand that we need public health solutions, not already failed drug war policies. Anti-trafficking legislation beefs up solicitation charges and turns them into felony charges, pushing more women in street-based economies deeper into the prison system with fewer options. And when talking about criminalization, a racial analysis must be centered. In other words, the criminal justice system is horribly racist. And in Georgia, Black people are prosecuted more harshly and are overrepresented compared to white people. While researching the GBI Georgia Bureau of Investigation's 2010 data of arrestees in Atlanta by race and gender, I found that 86% of
This conference will now be recorded.
anti-trafficking legislation beefs up solicitation charges, and which are prostitution and solicitation charges a misdemeanor normally, but anti-trafficking legislation beefs up the solicitation charge and turns them into felony charges, pushing more women into street-based economies, deeper into the prison system with fewer options. When talking about criminalization, a racial analysis must be centered. In other words, the criminal justice system is horribly racist. And in Georgia, Black people are prosecuted more harshly and are overrepresented than white people compared to white people. While researching the Georgia Bureau of Investigation 2010 data of arrestees in Atlanta by race and gender, I was able to get that data. I found that 86% of cisgendered women arrested for solicitation were Black, and only 14% were white. And I could get no data on trans women because there wasn't data on that page, and we probably know that a lot of trans women are being put in with men. Instead of creating ineffective legislation that further perpetuates the racist drug war, legislators need to address the root causes of trafficking and interpersonal violence that people in the sex trades endure, such as systemic racism, poverty, socioeconomic disparities, and barriers to accessing domestic violence and interpersonal violence shelters, housing, healthcare, jobs, and food. Lindsay is going to talk more about what sex workers looking for support in coming from violent relationships actually need. Meanwhile, from a larger policy perspective, to reduce harm from high-risk drug use and sex work, we need to be working on full decriminalization, decriminalization, or at least decarceration, and a lessening of criminalization, including of clients and third parties of adult voluntary sex workers. Of course, decriminalization does not include childhood sexual abuse. Absolutely does not, needs to be, it's very important. Many carceral feminists and faith-based anti-trafficking advocates support criminalizing just the clients, seeing it as a way to protect sex workers. This model is called the Nordic model or in demand or the Swedish model, but harms sex workers too because it's harder to screen clients and there are fewer clients, so sex workers must compete in dangerous situations. A lot of research on how this is really dangerous. If adult voluntary sex work were decriminalized, we would see more sex workers and trafficking victims picking up the phone and calling for help if being harmed, or when they knew of someone being raped or harmed, or if a child was being hurt. In fact, that's exactly what happened in New Zealand when sex work was nearly fully decriminalized there, with the exception that immigrants are still criminalized, and which needs to change. Decriminalizing sex work is part of effective anti-trafficking policy. When selling sex is a crime, sex workers are especially vulnerable to police brutality and rape. The decriminalization of sex work is not only a powerful strategy to end trafficking, but it also is an important strategy towards ending the AIDS epidemic. And as we explore ways in which the anti-trafficking policy is an extension of the drug war policy, legislation like the aforementioned PROTECT Act gives a clear legislative example of the inextricable link of this. Later, I'll go into more details about how this proposed law could even make syringes become evidence of trafficking, which would create a major disincentive for the key harm reduction strategy of using clean needles. According to an SF study by Blumenthal, RN, a nurse, published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, anti-drug policies which deny injection equipment should be reconsidered. Also, Blumenthal's study of 1,257 people who inject drugs in San Francisco found that those who simply feared an arrest for drug paraphernalia possession were 70% more likely to share needles. And I even found more studies at the NIH showing how syringe possession arrests were directly associated with syringe sharing. Laws that turn needles into evidence of trafficking absolutely run counter to HIV prevention initiatives, including harm reduction needle exchange programs, pharmacy-based distribution, and related syringe access services. The criminalization and confiscation of basic harm reduction supplies such as syringes and condoms increase the odds of positive STI HIV diagnoses, and there's plenty of evidence showing these outcomes.
Stella does a great job of explaining why the language behind the word trafficking doesn't help us. I want to talk today about what coercion, force, fraud, and unsafe working conditions actually look like in our lives. But first, I want to say that it's really important to me that we walk a delicate line here. It's important for harm reductionists to understand that all of the unsafe behaviors that society doesn't approve of exist on a spectrum. If we lump everyone into one category, we don't understand the actual conditions. Some of us genuinely love doing sex work and work in safe environments. Some of us wish we didn't have to, but find sex work a lot better than our other alternatives. And some of us are working in incredibly desperate situations. Regardless of where we are on the spectrum, none of us want to be rescued, as Stella says, or have our lives made worse by law enforcement and judicial involvement. Because of the narrative that anti-trafficking organizations have been pushing, some of us have felt a pressure to present ourselves as incredibly happy, fulfilled, sober, untraumatized people. This is understandable, but it can alienate sex workers who have real trauma in our lives. I think it's important that we don't just buy into the happy hooker myth. We may not all be sex slaves, but many of us face coercion and exploitation. And I think that even as we refuse to buy into more drug war nonsense, we can't just say we don't care about those of us who don't experience sex work positively. First of all, we care about all sex workers. And we need to know, as a movement, how to direct people to help those workers. So that's definitely going to be covered later today. What to do instead of more criminalization. Right now, though, I want to briefly discuss why we might not be happy hookers. First, there's capitalism, which means a lot of us don't have as much of a choice as we like. There's also criminalization, which, as Stella explained, puts up huge barriers to safety. It prevents us from legally screening clients, advertising safely, using condoms, and reporting violence. And then there's our life histories, which may or may not have trauma. Because of these factors, we have complicated lives, but we, even those of us facing force, fraud, coercion, or violence, still make lots of our own choices and have a sense of agency. And remember, from the beginning of Stella's presentation, our agency matters so much to us, and it's a huge part of our recovery capital. And for me, I honestly feel that sex work has given me a greater sense of agency than any previous job. It allows me to work random hours, make my own schedule, be my own boss, and survive despite significant mental and physical health issues. Society has this very specific narrative about what trafficking is. There's an idea that there are trucks full of women who were kidnapped or something and are being snuck across the border to work as slaves tied up in basements. But just because you're a migrant who does sex work doesn't mean you're facing trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion. And actually, many migrant sex workers who are facing exploitative conditions made some degree of choice, and they're not protected by anti-trafficking legislation. The same people who say they care about trafficking victims turn around and deport them to be killed in their home countries by the drug war. So I want us to look at this slide that I'm going to show and decide for ourselves who is a trafficking victim and who is a trafficker. So I'm just going to give us a minute to look over this ourselves, and we're going to think how they mash up with our ideas of trafficking. All right, so people had a chance to look over the scenarios, and these are all real scenarios, by the way, and we'll see what the law had to say about who is a trafficker and who is being trafficked. So these answers are kind of shocking, and we'll take a moment to soak them in. So that teenage girl who is being regularly beaten by her adult boyfriend, being forced to sell sex, and being told her newborn will be killed if she doesn't send a Facebook message asking a friend to join, she's in jail right now as a trafficker. Her boyfriend, however, is not. Those two adult women who were doing consensual sex work in Alaska for their mutual safety, one of them was arrested for trafficking, and the other one, despite being her trafficking victim, didn't have access to victims' resources because, to be fair, she wasn't really being trafficked. So I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds to look over these really appalling So we have a serious problem here, as you can see. Just like Stella discussed, these laws are being used to attack us, not protect us. We don't fit into any perfect little narrative that they have for us. So when it's time to help us, our behavior, like us consensually doing some sex work or us using drugs, disqualifies us. But when it's time to arrest us, they have no problem turning these laws against us. Part of the problem is that for many of us, force, fraud, coercion, and exploitation look less like the trafficking scenario everyone imagines, and a lot more like the domestic violence or intimate partner violence scenarios that we face. Look at these scenarios on the screen. None of these people were being trafficked or trafficking a stranger, except the last one, and this survivor was being taken advantage of by her case manager assigned to her by the government. So, to understand what trafficking looks like, you have to understand what the dynamics look like. The dynamics I am about to mention were first described by the Duluth model of domestic violence, and I've adapted them to fit with sex workers who use drugs. But first, it often comes from someone we love, a partner. And when it does, it's domestic violence or intimate partner violence. The domestic violence that we're talking about today is when one partner, not both partners, escalates a pattern of coercive behavior to gain or maintain power and control over the other partner. It is not a two-way street. Even if the person being abused is reacting poorly or violently, that isn't the person that's introducing the pattern with the goal of maintaining power and control. And it's all about power and control. And it's a pattern. And the pattern is not random or accidental. But the pattern can be hard to see if you aren't in the relationship. So it starts with a honeymoon period. We feel more loved and cared for than we ever have before. We've had lives of trauma, and we finally feel the families and connections we've always wanted. Sometimes the abusers are doing this to us on purpose to later control us. But sometimes the abusers are trying to get these magical feelings of belonging for themselves too. In this period, they start setting us up for isolation. They say things like, I love you so much that I only want to spend time with you alone, or only I can inject you. And then comes the tension building. Stuff comes up that triggers our partners to start the relationships on path towards violence. They're moody and irritable. We walk on eggshells, trying to make everything okay again. But no matter what we try, it doesn't work. Maybe we take extra clients to earn more money, but that just pisses our partners off by making them jealous. Then there's the explosion. It all builds up until there's this big event where everything explodes. Sometimes it's violence or severe verbal abuse or a huge incident with enormous consequences that involves cops or CPS. We might fight back, leave, or try to reason with our partners. And then there's sometimes an attempt at repair. But sometimes the apology isn't really genuine. They might say something like, oh, I'm sorry you're so sensitive. The abuser moves us back to the honeymoon period to start over. Eventually, as the cycle continues, the repair and honeymoon period may go away, but we're already hooked on that feeling of love and belonging by that time. And I want you to notice that even though this cycle is happening, we still have a sense of agency. We're still trying to make things work. We're still choosing to stay. We aren't usually chained up in basements 24/7 with zero agency. So what are some of the tactics people use to gain or maintain power and control while that cycle is happening that causes us to stay? Society may recognize severe physical abuse like beating us up, strangling us, using weapons. Physical abuse is also slapping, pushing, grabbing, restraining, hair pulling, spitting, kicking. Sexual abuse is sometimes recognized, like violent rape and some pimping. It also includes unwanted touch, coercion, refusing to use protection, using sexual power dynamics to intimidate us, and humiliating us sexually. But society almost never understands what's going on just below the surface. And again, it's all about power and control. Abusers deny the abuse, minimize their behaviors, and blame us for what's happening. They see things like, it didn't happen, it's not that big a deal, it's your fault, you're just crazy, you're just a junkie. They use isolation, controlling our access to the outside world. This includes going through our phones, using jealousy or fights with our families to block our access to support, being the only one to shoot us up, using withdrawal to control our ability to be away, and needing us as caregivers so we can't ever be away. They use economic abuse against us. For us, this can look like pimping, or they can prevent us from getting a job, or, on the other hand, make us be the only ones who work. They might make us panhandle, or give us allowances from what we earned, or not let us know about or have access to income or be able to save. They also use children against us. They threaten us with interfering in our CPS cases, violate guidelines set by CPS, make us feel guilty about the children, use children to relay messages, and use visitation to harass us. They use privilege against us. And when it's men abusing women, they use male privilege. That can look like pimping too, or just making us be the caregivers or treating us like servants. They're the ones who make all the big decisions and define men's and women's roles. They might use male jealousy or the concept of machismo as an excuse. They also use coercion and threats. They make or carry out threats to hurt us. They might also threaten to commit suicide or report us to ICE, CPS, or our families. They make us do things we don't want to do out of fear. They can use the threat of withdrawal to coerce us into sex work. They use emotional abuse, insults, puts downs, humiliation, mind games, guilt trips. They use intimidation. That's making us afraid by using looks, words, or gestures, or actions. It includes smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, displaying weapons, harassment, and ignoring boundaries. So if all that is happening, well, why don't we just leave? It's complicated. So in part, it's because of the system of isolation and power that they have set up over us. It's very sticky. And in part because of our economic circumstances when we're just barely surviving. And it's in part because of our trauma. It takes the average person 7 to 9 times to leave in a relationship. And it's in part because abusers use the pattern of the honeymoon period and violence to keep us stuck. DV services often talk about creating different kinds of safety plans, and that is very in line with harm reduction. They teach that people do go back and that they can make plans for staying in a relationship but staying safer, leaving a relationship in a safer way, or for moving on with life after a relationship has ended. They recognize that the act of leaving is the most dangerous time in a violent relationship, and they don't try to make that decision for you. And that's why domestic violence agencies, even though they don't call it harm reduction, are fantastic at harm reduction when it comes to unsafe relationships. They often don't know it, but they have the harm reduction spirit. We try to support people to make their own choices, stay as safe as possible, and find the support that they need before making a decision to leave so that they can be successful. There's nothing in harm reduction policy or DV best practices that suggests you should just force people to leave a relationship. It's very accepted that people need resources, education, and community support before they make that decision. Unfortunately, DV services often have not learned harm reduction philosophy when it comes to drug and sex work. And sadly, anti-trafficking services often don't have a harm reduction mindset when it comes to either relationships or sex work and drugs. So none of these services, as they occur in practice, were meant for us sex workers who use drugs. As Stella mentioned, the sex worker organizing group of Urban Survivors Union took on a recent project against the PROTECT Act. I'm co-spearheading that project with Katie Simon, and Stella has been heavily involved as well. We surveyed USU members and found out that, in practice, DV services are not available to us because of a huge range of issues. First, they separate us from our male teenagers, and they house our kids separately if they know we're drug users. Simply put, if we have to leave our kids to do it, we're not going to leave a dangerous situation. They exclude trans women, and also trans men, and discriminate against trans masculine, non-binary people, and masculine queer women. And also, they're unprepared to serve queer men. And they won't allow us to do sex work, which has sometimes been our only income for most of our lives, and they don't necessarily offer viable alternatives. I myself am too disabled to do most jobs. And again, this strips us of our agency. They force us to detox or enroll in rehabs or methadone programs with waiting lists. We know that women are most likely to be killed by a partner when leaving a relationship or shortly after having left. Forced detoxing in the middle of one of the hardest and most dangerous times of our lives just makes us more likely to overdose. And we don't have time to wait for a methadone program to have available spots or for a rehab to have an empty bed. Remember, the average survivor takes 7 to 9 times to leave a relationship. We need shelters to be available right when we need them. We need all the help we can get to leave. We shouldn't have to go back to a dangerous situation and wait. And even orgs that don't explicitly outlaw drugs or sex find ways to kick us out. They make us sign impossible to follow safety contracts. These safety contracts are often purposely written so that if you don't quit drugs or sex work, then you will fail. And they also eject us for nebulous reasons. For example, someone was ejected because the staff felt unsafe because a former client visited a court hearing. Just because the client wasn't socially acceptable, not because the client had done anything wrong. And it's not like she could choose who would show up at an open hearing. Shelters also isolate us, saying that we can't communicate with anyone we've ever sold sex to, used drugs with, or knows are abusers. But that means everyone, even though our communities help us the most. The truth is, abusers isolate us from our communities because they know how impossible it is to leave a relationship without a community, or how hard it is to survive alone when very poor. Shelters replicate this same behavior. And then we run out of time at the shelter and we're back on the street but more isolated. So who do we turn to? Our abusers. Senator Sherrod Brown, who is one of the people who introduced FOSTA SESTA, the bill that Stella described, is introducing the PROTECT Act. It started from him having a desire to help survivors of violence. He said he saw women were being coerced into sex work in a way that involved drugs. Survivors, he said, were not being protected by current laws. So here's an example of how coercion with drugs might look like in real life. There's a man and a woman, and they're dating. The man is abusive and uses an escalating pattern of coercive behavior to gain or maintain power and control over his partner. Though both partners are dependent on opiates, the man controls the woman's supply and uses the threat of withdrawal to control her behavior. He also makes her do sex work to get them both more drugs. But because of the way that the laws are used, even though that behavior is already illegal, he won't get in trouble for it. The PROTECT Act is trying to right this situation. Unfortunately, remember that slide I showed? These laws never end up helping us. The PROTECT Act is particularly dangerously worded. It targets the people it claims to protect, the trafficking survivors and sex workers who use drugs. I'm going to explain how harmful it is, using points from the one-pager that Katie Simon, Stella, the Sex Worker Organizing Group, and myself, with support from Kate D'Adamo and Reframe Health and Justice, have pulled together to explain the bill to legislatures. So, under the current Trafficking Victims Protection Act, coercive drug distribution is already covered. Prosecutors and investigators just aren't using existing jurisprudence that's there to help prosecute. Prosecutors don't know how to prosecute these cases, and it's hard to get sympathy for someone using drugs. Expanding criminalization won't address a lack of training for prosecutors or reduce the bias that society has against survivors who use drugs. The PROTECT Act just ends up attacking survivors while giving even more latitude to police and prosecutors. The PROTECT Act equates furnishing someone with any kind of drug causing them to engage in a commercial sex act with coercion. So what does that mean? It basically takes the existing anti-trafficking legislation, which specifies that trafficking involves causing someone to do labor with either force, fraud, or coercion. And then it expands the definition of coercion to include giving someone any kind of legal or illegal drug. So that means that doing drugs with a sex worker can suddenly become an act of trafficking, a federal crime. This is even if no force, fraud, or coercion are actually involved. What it really does is heighten the criminalization of sex workers who work together. And that's really dangerous because working together is a vital form of harm reduction. It allows us to watch each other's backs and protects us from client violence. It also lets us monitor each other when we're using, preventing overdose. Anti-trafficking legislation, as Stella discussed, has already targeted us for working together safely in the past. And right now, we're in the middle of an overdose epidemic, and one of the biggest risk factors is using alone. So, this bill undermines life-saving state Good Samaritan acts. Good Samaritan acts give people immunity for calling 911 for an overdose. If a sex worker or trafficking survivor is overdosing, under the PROTECT Act, people might hesitate to call for help, fearing a trafficking charge. This is going to create barriers to harm reduction and drug treatment, which we'll go into in a bit more depth later. SESTA FOSTA was a disaster. Sex workers warned legislators about it, but we were ignored. We were the experts in our own lives then, and we're the experts now. These same people are now saying that the PROTECT Act is survivor informed, but it increases criminalization of people already overly criminalized. It's not what survivors need. We know this bill will be used against vulnerable trafficking survivors for doing drugs in each other's company. Right now, there's a big push to defund police or to reform police, and right in the middle of that push, this will strengthen police instead of investing in communities. Additionally, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the PROTECT Act, while discouraging Good Samaritan laws and even possibly making naloxone use more challenging, and we'll get to that in a second, would be particularly devastating to communities of color. 2020 data collected in Missouri show that opioid overdose deaths have risen during the pandemic. It also shows that opioid epidemic has harmed Black people at a much higher rate than white people. And meanwhile, COVID-19 is mirroring those trends, with Black people being far more likely to have complications or die. So the PROTECT Act is not at all in line with the massive movement against white supremacy happening right now in the US. Black Lives Matter. And finally, it has some really scary implications for harm reduction organizations, which Stella will be addressing.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you, Lindsay. This could have so many dangerous ramifications. To understand some of them, we have to understand what naloxone does and how it is used. It makes receptors in your brain not able to respond to opioids for some time. This means that often when people with opiate dependencies are revived with naloxone, they wake up with withdrawal symptoms, as many of us know. For many people, that means they try to go and get more opioids as soon as possible. Sometimes abusers can use naloxone knowing this. They may threaten to Narcan someone for not complying or actually go so far as to administer naloxone as a punishment. For many people, the way they find resources to get opioids is from sex work. And this law would make abusive naloxone use become trafficking. This is because naloxone is a drug, and this law targets any drug or substance, regardless of whether it is legal or not. It would be administering a drug that causes someone to do sex work. But the law isn't specific. If you were a harm reduction organization that administered naloxone to save a life, or another person, that is a harm reductionist that used naloxone to save a life, that could be interpreted as a trafficking felony if it caused, if it, somebody needed to do that, seemed to cause someone to go and do sex work. While it's easy to say that prosecutors won't do that, remember that little quiz that Lindsay gave, going into more detail? They always find a way. They're very, very good at finding ways to turn us into traffickers or to use that law, um, but then not actually help us when we're actually victims of violence and trafficking. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, it will also be easy to target paraphernalia as evidence of coercion. That's because while the PROTECT Act doesn't target paraphernalia per se, paraphernalia is already very broadly considered evidence by courts. That includes harm reduction supplies. This is already happening with condoms, where condoms aren't illegal per se also, but they are used as evidence of trafficking, and evidence of prostitution and sex work. By expanding coercion to include drugs, now harm reduction supplies, such as clean needles, can be pulled into evidence of trafficking. All the barriers that I just mentioned that target harm reduction services will, as I mentioned before, will stoke the spread of HIV and Hep C, and will do this the most, and will do the most damage in places like the drug war-torn South, Southern U.S., which in the U.S. is the epicenter, as many of us know, is the epicenter of the HIV epidemic. Many of us access healthcare and recovery services through harm reduction agencies. So this will make it harder for us to access care for drug and alcohol dependency, pushing people who might actually help further away. Again, carceral solutions, quote unquote solutions, are not answers to public health issues. Harm reductionists absolutely don't need to have any more barriers for the life-saving work of handing out clean needles and naloxone than we already deal with.
Thank you, Stella. So we talked a lot about what bad attempts to address trafficking look like, as well as what inadequate services for survivors look like. But legislators, harm reduction orgs, and domestic violence agencies need to know what to actually do. We can't go in and tell the senator, hey, just stop trying to help exploited sex workers. So our organizing group had to look at what it is that sex workers, survivors of domestic violence, and survivors of trafficking actually want and need. According to our research, services that we actually need would be, first and foremost, led by directly impacted people. That's because directly impacted people are the ones who understand what the conditions on the ground are, and harm reduction is only harm reduction if it is in response to the actual material conditions of sex work and drug use. It's also because we are the ones best positioned to help our own community. Services should be non-coercive and non-judgmental and based in harm reduction best practices. That means evidence-based. And that includes sex work too. We need services to allow us to do sex work and approach that with harm reduction. And we need access to methadone if we want it. Our community needs you to advocate for take-home doses and remove barriers to treatment. That includes reducing the cost and not making us go miles every single day, effectively chaining us to a clinic. Methadone can allow people with opioid dependency to live lives free of chaos and to not need to rely on a partner to get well. We also need you to support our families. Allow us to be with our own children. We really are the best situated to care for our children. Most of the time, our biggest obstacle to better parenting is a lack of resources. So provide us with those, and you'll see our children flourish. We need to transition to safe, stable housing. You can build links with local housing services. Mainly, we need barrier-free housing models with fully supportive, entirely non-coercive housing. That includes treatment for our health, mental health, and chronic pain. And that should, again, be offered non-coercively, because remember, our agency is so crucial to our recovery and our sense of selves. And personal agency is a huge pillar of harm reduction. It's not harm reduction if we don't believe that people are their own primary agents of change in their lives. We need shelters to use transformative justice to solve problems when we're receiving your support, rather than have you kick us out at the first sign of trouble. For example, if we break a rule, bring in transformative justice solutions. But to do this, you should build links to solid mediation services who understand the power dynamics involved in mediation before anything goes wrong. And finally, services shouldn't reenact abusive dynamics by confiscating our money, searching us, especially never internal search, using restraints, or constantly questioning our judgment. They should be trauma informed. The bottom line is they should allow us to direct our own lives. Harm reduction demands that sex workers and people who use drugs are the experts in our own lives. So, therefore, you have just heard a presentation from the experts. And after you've left, we hope you'll think about ways to empower us by including us, not by supporting more drug war policies in disguise. We are really thankful that you're all here today and heard what we had to say. And now we'd like to open the floor for anyone who has questions. We really covered a lot.